Ryan was about to go outside of the house when suddenly Junko's eyes met her. He looked at her confused. He asked her, making her frown. She nodded at him and took her file, about to go out of the door, but stopped by Junko. She glanced at Junko, who was holding her arm. She said and took her arm out of his grip. He rolled his eyes and let her go. Ryan was sitting in front of Dr. Jeff, who was busy working on his laptop. She was so impatient. She just wanted her father's medical report. She asked him while tapping her finger on his table. He shook his head, making her sad. He reminded her again, but she had some hopes if she found something. Choi Sobin was standing on the terrace where Ryan and he used to spend time together. He whispered, taking a glance at the moon, missing his love. His eyes welled up with tears. He sobbed while wiping his tear away. He sat and chuckled sadly. Ryan looked at the mirror and checked herself last look before stepping out of the room. She went downstairs and passed by the living room. Junko was reading a newspaper while sipping his hot coffee. He secretly took a glance at Ryan, who was talking on the phone with the client. She gave some hope and positive comments to Mrs. Kim just to cheer her up. Ryan glanced at Jungkook as she felt the powerful gaze of someone on her. He immediately looked away as their eyes met for a few seconds. Ryan rolled her eyes and sighed. She hoped and was about to leave but stopped at her track as Jungkook called her. He said out of the blue, making her frown her eyebrow. She chuckled at his sudden caring behavior. Ryan was about to go out without answering, but Junko held her hand, making her stop. He tightened his grip on her wrist. She became annoyed and jerked Junko's hand away. She said angrily and walked outside. Junko smiled while looking at Ryan and his old picture, which they captured when they were in the high school. He caressed her face with his thumb. He said a tear rolled down, making him let out a sigh of pain. Junko's eye frowned as his phone buzzed. He checked his phone and there was few messages of Hanul. He checked her messages and sighed. Junko took his car keys and went out of the office. Meanwhile, Vine stepped out of the court with a disappointed look on her face. She sighed. Vine knows she messed up very badly. She lost her case because of irresponsibility. Mr. Kim came towards her and patted her back. Mrs. Kim smiled at her husband's state. Wyan nodded at them and left them alone. Junko said coldly. She smiled and held his hand. Hanal caressed his hand and she felt something. Her gaze landed on his wedding ring. Hanal smiled and glanced back at Junko, who was staring at her emotionlessly. Hanal said with teary eyes. Junko passed her a tissue box. She took out one tissue paper and glanced at him again. He remained straight at Hanal's face with no regret. She chuckled and looked away. Junko looked at his mobile and checked the time. It was already 20 past 8. He stood up and left her alone. Ryan was talking to the bartender about what happened in the court. She was talking shit continuously, making him groan in a noise. Soon Subin ran to her and checked her head to toe. He sighed in relief, finding her all fine. He asked her softly while caressing her cheeks. She pouted and burst out. Ryan was crying massively. Sobin patted her back and tried to comfort her. She was sobbing harder, which caused everyone's attention around her. Subin asked her politely. Django parked his car in his garage and stepped out. He entered and sighed in relief as he reached home. He murmured and went to her room to check if Ryan was okay or not. Junko frowned as he didn't see her in there. He ran to the kitchen. He asked to the maid who was cooking. She questioned without thinking, which made Jungkook angry. He yelled and the maid flinched a little. She uttered, he nodded and left. Junko started getting worried about her. He called her many times, but Ryan's phone was switched off. Suddenly, he got a message from his assistant and he checked it immediately. Junko's eyebrow frowned as he saw Ryan drinking in the bar. He shook his head and took his car key out of the pocket and went to chase her. Jungkook entered the club. He gritted his teeth as Jungkook saw Soin comforting his wife. His one hand was on Ryan's cheek and the other one was on her waist. Jungkook felt disgust because Soin touched on his wife. He rushed to them and pushed Soin away from Ryan. He yelled the last word to make sure Ryan now belonged to him. Jungkook said while gritting his teeth. Meanwhile, Ryan was sitting there and staring at him lovingly. He turned his gaze on his wife, who was fully drunk. He cuping. Jungkook's eyes softened as his gaze matched Ryan. She giggled like a kid, making both hearts pound. Subin smiled at her state. He loved her being herself after a long time. That was not the first time he was seeing her like that. Junko smiled. It was the first time he was seeing her like that, which was making him stare at her. She sat and pinched his cheek. Sobin's heart clenched. Seeing them, he understood he was the third person here. Subin smiled and left the bar. Vian smiled cutely at Jungkook, who was lost in her. She said while hiccuping, making him giggle. He patted her head. Vian pouted. She denied. As the drink worked on her, he shook his head and took her in his arm. He said while adjusting her position, "Whine, whine," and tried to get out of his grip. Junko said in his deep voice, making her gulp. Junko warned her. Vian nodded her head immediately in agreement. He sighed and went inside to take her stuff. Vian glanced everywhere and pouted. She started crying. Subin sighed as he hopped in the car. A question hit on his mind, making him sad in some way. Sobin closed his eyes and smiled. He slammed his hand on the steering wheel. Sobin wiped his tear away. He started his car and drove away.